Sometimes known as the father of occultism, or the master magician, or the founder of Thelema, or sometimes just the beast incarnate, Edward Alexander Crowley, better known as Aleister Crowley, was perhaps one of the most peculiar men you'll find in the Occult History Explained series. For one, given that he only died in 1947, there is a ton of information available about not just his personal life, but also the sort of dark practices he was involved in that would see him viewed as not just an oddball of the time, but a satanic threat to Christianity. Some say he was merely a poet, a writer, and a keen player of chess, but others swear by his dark magic and his ability to perform archaic rituals and esoteric sorcery. It's only natural that many of his exploits were likely exaggerated to some degree, but when your own mother would come to refer to you as the beast or the devil, it does leave one to wonder about what kind of man Aleister Crowley was. In his prime, he considered himself to be one of the most amazing figures of his time, a man who certainly was not shy of tooting his own horn. By his peers, it was not uncommon to hear him described as self-indulgent, exuberant, lavish, and pretty much outspoken against organized religion, most notably Christianity, which he resented. To be outspoken about religion in the early 20th century was not necessarily a huge taboo as it had been a century earlier, but Crowley didn't care much. In fact, he was often shielded from any potential outcry of his bold statements by the indisputable fact that he was filthy rich. Crowley wasn't just a pompous man with money though, although I'm sure many saw him that way. He had an uncanny ability to merge into any organization he entered and could assimilate with any group before, more often than not, usurping the leader and establishing himself as an authoritative figurehead. This ability to assimilate and work through the ranks would serve him exceptionally well, not just because he was a man who enjoyed control, but because he was even linked with the British intelligence agency as being a spy. He was the type of man who you could not win an argument with because of his ratty ability to claw his way to victory, and those who challenged him would learn the hard way that debating him was futile. He was, as you might imagine, highly intelligent, but with that intelligence came a deep-rooted arrogance that only grew more intense the older he got. Those closest to him would state he was capable of both emotional and physical cruelty, and whilst he was a man of great wisdom and profound insight, he was keen to alienate himself, perhaps deeming the inner cogs of his mind to be too great to be shared with the mortals that flocked to him. As mentioned, Crowley was rich. In fact, he was born into wealth, for his father owned a lucrative brewing business. But whilst Crowley's family seemed pretty tight, some say Crowley fell out of place from the very beginning. His parents were devout Christians and were keen on passing down their faith to their son, but Crowley would come to reject the notions of Christianity, and like most rich kids, they began to act up in an effort to escape their father's shadow. When Crowley's father died of cancer, Crowley began to turn into a nuisance at school. This rebellious nature followed him throughout his college years, where he began to openly condemn Christianity, calling out its inconsistencies to his teachers and his peers, before turning his back on his faith entirely. He began to smoke excessively, began to practice masturbation, and eventually upgraded to buy prostitutes, all to show his disdain for the religion. Some say that this defiance was his way of demonstrating that God had no power over him, and that man could do as he pleased if he cast religion aside, a notion that would become a part of his very own doctrine. Of course, after having sex with all these prostitutes, he did contract gonorrhea. Crowley spent a whole load of time at university playing chess. He also developed a love for literature and poetry, and he'd actually go on to publish some acclaimed content. It was also here in university that he began to experiment with his sexuality, identifying himself as bisexual and entering his first gay relationship with Herbert Charles Pollitt, the president of the drama club. Unfortunately, Crowley became more and more interested in Western esotericism, and it was not something Pollitt was able to really get into himself. Because of this, their relationship ended, though it is thought it is not a relationship that Crowley was ever quite able to get over. It is also here during his years at university that he was thought to have enlisted with the British Secret Service, although some believe that this was later dropped for a career in the occult. By his mid-20s, Crowley had moved to Switzerland and met a chemist named Julian L. Baker, who, much like Crowley, had an interest in alchemy. Upon returning to London, Baker would introduce Crowley to an occult society known as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a secret organisation that was said to have practiced things along the likes of alchemy, astral travel, and other forms of supernatural magic. But whilst this seemed right up Crowley's street, some believe that he didn't join this society because of his interest in the supernatural, but because he was indeed still secretly working for the British Secret Service, and had been instructed to infiltrate the faction and discover what it was that they were actually doing behind closed doors. Crowley would later seek tutorship from Alan Bennett, another member of the Golden Dawn, who would come to teach Crowley about magic, the use of rituals, and the use of drugs. Whether the latter had some influence on Crowley's success in the business of the occult is up for debate, but whether or not Crowley was actually being taught magic at the Golden Dawn, it became apparent that the other members didn't like him much. They were repulsed by his bisexuality and lawless lifestyle, and wanted him expelled from the society. He was refused initiation in the second order of the society and held from progressing, but this didn't stop him. He went straight to the leader of the Golden Dawn, Samuel Liddell McGregor Mathers, and was able to talk him into granting him admission, an act that would drive a wedge between the community of the Golden Dawn. Unfortunately, both Crowley and Mathers would soon be isolated from the group when they tried to snatch the Vault of the Adepts, a temple space used by the Golden Dawn members, only to lose a court case as well as their positions in the society. Some believe that all of this, however, was Crowley's intention, who was supposedly still working for the British Secret Service, who had ordered him to undermine Mathers' influence on the rest of the Golden Dawn and see him evicted from his post. Crowley would proceed to travel all over the world, from Mexico to India to even Japan during the early 1900s, where during this time he would continue to practice in the ways of the occult. It was when he arrived in Paris did he become friends with the painter Gerald Kelly, and perhaps more importantly, friends with his sister. It's understood that Gerald's sister Rose was being forced into a marriage, and so in order to save her from this fate, Crowley married her instead and stole her away to Egypt. Whilst this ruined his friendship with Kelly and tarnished Rose's name amongst her family, Crowley did end up falling in love with her. It is here in Cairo with his newfound wife where Crowley's story really begins to take a strange turn, and where the root of the spiritual philosophy of Thelema began to grow. It was in February 1904 where both Crowley and his wife Rose began to perform rituals that invoked the ancient deities from Osiris, Isis and Horus, all the while practicing Islamic mysticism. Crowley would come to declare that during these intense rituals that saw them communing with the gods, Rose became frequently delirious and would repeatedly tell him that the gods were waiting for him. Perhaps more peculiarly, she would wind up leading him to a museum where she became entranced by a 7th century still known as the Still of Ankh-Efen Khonsu. Whilst it may have appeared to the regular man as an artifact from an era long ago, to Alistair and Rose, this piece became a central part of what would become Thelema and would take on the name the Still of Revealing. To Crowley, the piece depicted the 3 central gods of the Egyptians, that being Nut, Hadit and Ra Horus. Coincidentally, Crowley also became fixated on the fact that the still had been catalogued in the museum under the number 666, the mark of the beast, yet another essence that would become central to his belief system. But how exactly did Crowley come to these revelations? Well, he would later testify that he would hear a voice talking to him, that which belonged to a spirit known as Iwas. He explained that Iwas was a messenger of the Egyptian god Horus, and that he would come to write down everything the voice told him. These writings would eventually be the sacred text of the Thelema belief, and would be known as the Book of Law. Whilst I myself haven't read the book, it does sound morbidly fascinating. Firstly, one of the main testaments is that humanity was entering a new phase, or aeon, and that Crowley himself was the chosen one, a prophet, so to speak, who would lead mankind into this new era. In this new world, a new law would be established that allowed each man to essentially live his life as he chose to live it. In fact, there was even a phrase established within the community of Thelema and would become the mantra of the entire philosophy. It went something along the lines of, "Do what thou wilt." That being said, given Crowley's arrogance and unwillingness to do what others told him, he initially resisted the spirit Iwas and resented the writings he had penned. He ignored most of what the text dictated, that which insisted he steal the steel of revealing from the museum and establish his own fortified island for Thelema and its members to grow. Crowley's life would take some unexpected twists and turns throughout the early 20th century. His wife gave birth to a daughter, appropriately named Lilith, but unfortunately the child would die very young, something that Crowley would come to blame his wife for due to her apparent alcoholism. His marriage broke down and he was linked with a string of affairs before welcoming another daughter into his life by Rose. He would eventually divorce Rose by 1911, and she would become institutionalized because of a drinking problem. He would continue to conduct rituals in order to re-establish a connection with the spirit Iwas, which is something he claimed to have achieved whilst under influence of cannabis. He also began to champion cannabis as an inducer of the mystics, sort of a bridge between the two states of consciousness. Iwas would dictate 2 further texts to him, and the ideal Thelema was padded out with even more ideas and so-called truths. Crowley's extravagant lifestyle would soon see his inheritance dry up though. His poetry and his prose didn't really sell that well, and given that he was either hiking in Naples, where he was responsible for several deaths of his expedition due to an accident, or shooting robbers in India, something he was eventually kicked out of the country for, the money sure wasn't going to last long. After all, he was hardly a frugal man, and what with a daughter to look after, you'd think a man with such high intelligence would have saved some income for the more important things. In order to make some cash, he was hired by the Earl of Tankerville, a superstitious man who had come to believe he was under the attack of witchcraft. Given Crowley's notoriety on the subject of the occult, it became something of a spiritual bodyguard for him. He also began tutoring students who wished to learn about the occult, and would eventually take one of them, a man named Victor Newberg, as a sexual partner. Crowley would also found a successor to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and would name it AA, and would operate in the same way that the Golden Dawn did, but with much more Thelemic influence. After travelling to Algeria, Crowley began reciting from the Quran on a daily basis. He would also come to publish many of his beliefs and ideas in a book known as the Equinox, something which longtime friend Samuel Mathers would resent him for, because he accused Crowley of publishing the secrets of the original Golden Dawn. In fact, Crowley would become convinced that Mathers had actually been using magic against him, but this might have been said to drum up more excitement over the occult and achieve more attention from the media as his fame began to grow. He began to sensationalize the occult, pandering to the ideas that he was a Satanist and that he was conducting human sacrifices, despite engaging in neither. Of course, all this drama attracted new members to his newfound society. It wouldn't be long before another society put Crowley under their crosshairs and claimed he'd stolen their secrets and published them too. The Ordo Templi Orientis, another occult organisation ran by German occultist Theodor Reuss, accused Crowley of this in 1912, but the two would actually become friends, and Crowley would even be appointed as the head of the British branch of the Ordo Templi Orientis. He was even able to incorporate more of the Thelemic beliefs into the order and devised a sort of sex magic, that which was based off of anal sex. Unfortunately, there was more heartbreak on the horizon for Crowley when his longtime partner Newberg left him after an intense ritual that lasted for 6 weeks. It had contained a strong use of drugs and implemented a great deal of sex acts in order to invoke the gods Mercury and Jupiter. But there was something about this particular ritual, or maybe this was the last straw that broke the camel's back for Newberg, that saw him distance himself from Crowley, something that Crowley would curse him for. By the time of the First World War, Crowley would move to New York and, interestingly, began to support Germany against Britain. He would declare himself to be of Irish heritage and managed to worm his way into the employ of George Sylvester Viereck, a German spy who published a propagandist paper known as the Fatherland, which sought to keep the United States neutral during the conflict. Crowley would be declared as a traitor to Britain for his newfound allegiance, but as it turned out, Crowley was said to have been working as a double agent, once again for the Secret Service. His objective was to infiltrate the German operations in New York and to undermine them by any means possible. Establishing himself as a writer for the German outlet Fatherland allowed him to control the voice in parts of the paper. Furthermore, it has been theorized that Crowley was responsible for the German Navy attacking the Lusitania, an English ocean liner that traversed into American waters, for this would ensure the Americans would keep out of the affair after witnessing German strength. But Crowley's true intention was more sinister, for he knew the Americans would not allow such a thing to go by unattended in their own waters, and would be a catalyst to their eventual involvement. By the 1920s, Crowley was a desolate man, with virtually nothing of his inheritance left. Somehow, he would have just enough to move to Italy and rent a villa, which would become known as the Abbey of Thelema, a temple of a sort for the members of his growing faction. Here, members were given their own robes and would perform rituals to the ancient Egyptian sun god Ra. Whilst here at the Abbey of Thelema, he began to nurse or indulge a growing heroin addiction, which he'd earned after a doctor had prescribed him the drug to calm his asthma. He took up painting as a means to facilitate his gaudy lifestyle and went on to write a commentary of his Book of the Law. Perhaps one of his most insidious ventures here in Italy, though, was that he allowed children, under the guise of education, to come and watch acts of sex magic. As if that wasn't bad enough, his heroin addiction soon turned to a cocaine addiction. He began to neglect not only himself, but the Abbey of Thelema as well, whereby it became an unsanitary dwelling, frequented by stray cats and dogs. Not all the members of the Abbey of Thelema were willing to put up with this shoddiness, however, and many chose to leave. Some became appalled by the same-sex rituals that they were forced to engage in order to maintain their membership, and others simply didn't have the bones for some of the tasks required. There had been reports of members being forced to drink the blood of sacrificed animals, and some who were required to cut themselves each time they used the pronoun I. When these allegations became common knowledge of the Italian government, Crowley was quickly deported and the Abbey of Thelema was closed. Towards the end of his life, Crowley went through a string of lovers who he performed sex magic with. He was marred by poor health, however, and you could say he was pretty much on his last legs. How he got anyone to sleep with him must be a testament to his character. He must have had some serious game. He moved to France during this time, but just like in Italy, the French government got word of what they deemed were sordid endeavours and quickly deported him. They also believed him to be a spy for the Germans, likely on the account that he'd spread German propaganda in America on behalf of the British Secret Service. By the 1930s, Crowley moved to Portugal, where he actually attempted to fake his own death. This may have been to drum up attention to the opening of his art exhibition, but apparently, few of his pieces actually garnered any attention, even with his miraculous resurrection. By 1935, he was declared bankrupt, where it was revealed that he'd been spending more than 3 times his income over several years. Before long, he was literally living off of the donations of various societies. By the Second World War, he tried to offer his services to the Naval Intelligence Division, but funnily enough, they declined. He remained in service amongst the British intelligence community, but his role at the time was largely unknown. He never quite shook his heroin addiction though, and after moving around Britain for a time, he would end up dying in 1947 of chronic bronchitis at the age of 72. Perhaps the most interesting thing about Aleister Crowley, other than his vivid affairs and his colourful shenanigans throughout his life, is his belief system, Thelema. Many have come to see Thelema as a religion, or even modern paganism, something Crowley would have probably loved, given that he wanted Thelema to bring some sort of mainstay influence into Europe. And given how much of an ego this dude had, he's probably looking down, or up at us, and laughing his arse off with how many people would come to see the world through his eyes. As mentioned, Crowley earnestly believed that the 20th century was where humanity entered into this Aeon of Horus, a new age in which human beings began to take control of their own lives. There was an implication here that religion would be dropped, social norms would be abandoned, and man would simply live free from his obligations. He believed that the former Aeon, the Aeon of Osiris, which took place before the 20th century, belonged to Christianity and Islam. Meanwhile, the Aeon before this was the Aeon of Isis, one that saw much of the world more akin to the worship of the goddess, or some maternal entity. Naturally, Crowley was the prophet of the Aeon of Horus, thus marking him as one of the most important people, if not the most important person in the world during his lifetime. Funny that. The basis of Thelema, though, is pretty sound. It is merely the idea that human beings can control their own destiny, and should control their own destiny, in order to discover their true purpose. This would be known to Crowley as the Great Work, in that man and woman embark on a journey to find that which truly pleases them. Of course, Crowley, as I'm sure you've gathered, was a huge believer of magic, something which he would come to spell as magic with a K at the end, which is an archaic way of spelling the word. You might think this is a bit pretentious, but well, this is a video about Aleister Crowley, so. He would define magic as a combination of science and art, particularly that which causes changes to occur in what one would expect to be the norm. He also believed that the communication with beings on a higher plane of existence was another form of magic, though of course, this sort of magic, even in later times, seems to be missing the science part. He also believed that magic was a bridge between religion and science, and that the gaps in between could be explained by mystic forces. In an attempt to prove such magic, he would urge his fellow magicians to record all of their experiments in a scientific fashion, so as to validate its authenticity. By this, you might say that yesterday's magic automatically becomes today's science, because once something has been achieved and becomes common knowledge, is it still magic, or does it become exclusively science? Whilst he was keen to experiment, and was very outspoken about the use of magic and what magic was, most of his definitions seem to always include technology, as if technology itself was the magic, and not fireballs, ice missiles, thunderbolts, or anything cool like that. As we've spoken about already, Crowley's practice of magic usually had some sort of sex involved in it. I mean, let's be real, the guy had more sex in a year than I've had in... Never mind. But the point is, the guy knew how to play the game, or at least was surrounded by people who he was able to coerce into sexual engagements in the name of magic. Magic in this sense could be performed in a variety of different ways, but the followers of Thelema were expected by Crowley to perform both heterosexual and homosexual acts. He believed that through this sex magic, followers could harness some sort of energy that could be used in other areas of their lives, such as their career, their happiness, or even their health, and not just a means to get some. It's even been understood that the consumption of sexual fluids was encouraged by Crowley, and this was something of a sacrament. Regardless of what you might think of Aleister Crowley, the dude literally did it all. His ideas may have been a bit out there, but he inspired and continues to inspire many people, with his range of intense and imaginative ideas. His life was sewn together by both tragedy and excitement, and if you were to read his partially complete autobiography, The Confessions of Aleister Crowley, It literally reads like a movie. Throw in the occult and the magic, and we have here perhaps one of the most fascinating and baffling men from recent history. But let me know your thoughts on today's long-awaited return to Occult History Explained, and what you thought about Aleister Crowley. Do you have any more stories about him or Thelema? Perhaps you're a follower yourself?